Welcome to the first Loughborough conversation, hosted by the Institute of Advanced Studies at Loughborough University. My name is Professor James Stanyer, and I'm really great to welcome Professor Barbie Zelizer, all the way from University of Pennsylvania in the United States. Welcome, Barbie. Barbie is the Raymond Williams Chair of Communication and at the Annenberg School of Communication. So Barbie, welcome to Loughborough.
Thank you.
Your book on what journalism could be asks us to, if you like, reimagine journalism for the 21st century. I would just really perhaps get you to maybe kind of reprise some of the key points of the book, and particularly on why journalism needs to be reimagined.
Journalism needs reimagining because so much of what we've thought about is outdated. It's no longer relevant. It no longer provides us the kind of productive prism for thinking about journalism in all of its forms. And this includes really kind of adopting in an almost uncritical fashion the idea that journalism is inherently Western or global Northern, the idea that journalism is inherently rational, the idea that journalism is somehow connected in its most inner workings to democracy and to liberalism. We know that that's not the case. Today we know more than ever that that's not the case. So the question becomes, what alternative prisms do we want to adopt instead? And I feel that there are multiple prisms having to do with emotion, with contingency, with visuality, with memory, that are very much part of what goes on in journalism, but have never been part of its default setting.
Listening to you just got me thinking about, if you, in some senses, the reaction of legacy media, or at least news institutions, to this kind of what I would call maybe kind of thought-provoking or provocative kind of discourse, and whether they've tried to engage with you in any respect about thinking about how they report particular events, or in some senses taking on board these ideas.
Whether or not journalists have engaged?
Well, the institutions of journalism.
Well,
I'm thinking whether they're kind of very much part of the problem, or...
Yeah, the issue is that journalists and journalism institutions probably remain the most skeptical to the pulses of criticism that are out there in our public life. Journalists don't like being critiqued. News institutions don't like being told what they might do better. That said, I will say that those journalists and news institutions that I know personally, I've developed a very productive relationship with. So you go back and forth between living in the academy, having led a life as a journalist before I ever got to the academy, and figuring out how to make them work better together. And I think what it involves is being more flexible on both ends than what has typically been the case. I don't think it's reasonable to assume that journalists or news institutions are going to read academic books. They don't have the time, they don't have the interest, it's not their lingo. So the question is really, what can we do as scholars to adapt that discourse in ways that make it easier for journalists and news institutions to actually take count of what we're saying?
I mean, I could see, in a way, particularly in the States, with the kind of postgraduate training, grad school and journalism training, that in some senses it's maybe kind of the reimagining process will take place over time. It's not something that can be accomplished in a short time scale. So I just wondered whether you kind of had reflections about the kind of the input on the training process.
Yeah,
perhaps.
No, I think that's true. I mean, I know that the things I'm saying today, I've been saying for, 28 years, so it's not like I've changed. I just keep saying the same things and applying them to different contexts. And these are questions that I brought with me from being a journalist. All of my research has always been about the question of how journalists establish themselves as credible, authoritative spokespeople, right, or translators of the real world. And I say that having been one and seen how people took what I would write as a reporter seriously. So all of my work is some different kind of riff on that question. To assume that it's going to have quick, responsive environments is I think that's being naive. I do know that, as my students have have come out and gone on to become heads of departments and chairs in other institutions. I know that the gospel, whatever it looks like, is taking different forms with them. So I think it is a question of moving over time. I want to say also that it is a question of moving up from the bottom echelons. And I think that if we're going to think differently about journalism's role in society, we need to be investing in massive amounts of effort in media literacy. If we don't start teaching people, and I'm talking grade school, I'm talking secondary school, start teaching people that their expectations of journalism need to be refined, then we're not going to get anywhere. So yes, it's a generations-long project. I believe that current circumstances are probably about the most productive in getting us to think that this is necessary, but that doesn't mean that it's going to change overnight.
Yeah. Part of your attending a conference here at Loughborough about memory and time and the media. I wonder if you could sort of perhaps for the viewer tease out some of the themes, particularly in your early work, going right the way through to contemporary work, that deals with the kind of journalism and memory and the role of the journalist really as this kind of really responsible role as the center of collective memory.
Well, journalism has often touted itself as a record of the present. That is what distinguishes journalism from history, journalism from political discourse, journalism from education, which is, it is about creating a record for what happens in the here and now. And that's a very useful kind of self-definition. But what it does is it introduces all kinds of distortions in terms of how much journalism actually looks to the past all the time. We wouldn't be able to understand news discourse if it weren't basing itself off coverage of things in earlier moments, off metaphors or analogies that take place across time, off treatments, formulaic treatments of different kinds of news events and issues that themselves are temporally determined. And what this means, and I think that what has been also central to my work, is the very fundamental idea that not only does the news emerge as the work of construction, but journalists are kind of at the forefront of pushing memory, the past, different versions of events, analogies that perhaps pull events into closer quarters with each other than they might otherwise have, because it doing so sheds a really nice, positive, shiny light on journalists. And so there is a strategy by which journalists engage in memory work that it's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about why it is that the New York Times sees Vietnam, right, as relevant to a particular event, while the Washington Post might see the Korean War, right? Very different kinds of engagements. And I think that it's time that we start paying more attention to this. We live in the past at the same time as we live in the present. We can't engage in the present without some repair to past behavior, past beliefs, past practices. Journalists are no exception to this rule. So I think we have to both take journalism at its word, the idea that it is a record of the present, by understanding that that is only partially true.
Mm-hmm. And when you've spoken to journalists about their memory work, and do they kind of, is this something they acknowledge explicitly, or is it something that it just kind of enters into their in an unconscious way?
It depends how self-critical they're being. I don't think that talking to journalists about their being arbiters of memory is a particularly professionally useful prism on what they do. But certainly when you present a journalist with evidence that he or she has done this and somebody else did that and why, they begin to understand that there's no question that this is their own of their own making. And two, I think that this is useful because I think that the notion of journalism, and I say this in a generous kind of rethinking of how to kind of enhance our regard for journalism, I don't think it does journalists any good to be credited with providing the record of the present. I think that our expectations are way overblown. I think that we would do better recognizing that journalists and news organizations and new media startups that dealing in information flow, all of them provide parts of what's going on today. All of them engage with parts of what went on in earlier days. And I think that if we as a public could begin to understand that maybe it's the lesser expectation that will get us more in appreciating journalism, we would be in a better place. And so in part, I would say that much of the constant critique of journalism, which I just get so demoralized hearing all the time, has to do with the fact that we are tasking them with things that they can't possibly provide.
In a way, the yardstick is kind of set up by a kind of, with a very specific model of journalism coming through from the late 19th century, early 20th century, and that is something which, from what I read, in a sense, the alternatives aren't out there, and in a sense it maybe needs the public to be involved in that conversation. Perhaps just talking to you now, it seems to come out in a way that perhaps I didn't kind of get before, that actually it's a public conversation, and what kind of journalism do we need as a mature democracy, and is it one that's based around purely rationalism and the rational voter and informing citizens? And
right. When you think about it, that also, when you engage with something, you engage with it because you care about it, right? You're passionate about it. Why would we expect journalism not to draw upon passion? So the kinds of things that we attach to journalism create exceptional circumstances that make it different rather than more similar to other kinds of interactions. And if there's one thing I would like to see, at some point, I don't know when, is our understanding that journalism is one form of public expression like many others, each with their own rituals, each with their own strengths and their own weaknesses, but understanding, letting go of some of the exceptionalist tone with which we tend to both praise it, usually in the kind of optimistic, this is how it's going to be, or this is how it should be, and more often damn it, in the sense of this is why it's not working.
No, I can clearly see that in a sense, but in the sense of setting yourself with a kind of, shall we use the term, counter-hegemonic project in terms of the world of journalism, I think in some senses it's a struggle, I would imagine, and one that I think kind of, as I said earlier, takes time, but I think also one that I think that is actually even more needed, because what I would strike me coming from the conference is the kind of, this may be happening anyway. I mean, there's a kind of tendency for people to either have the optimists and the pessimists within journalism studies, it's all going to hell in a handcart or everything's really great. I just wondered whether, people kind of often jump and think, well, look at Vice News, for example. This is the new direction of journalism. But I don't get the impression that that's where you're saying it. It's not this headlong rush to anything goes. So I kind of... Yeah.
Well, it's funny. Because right now, for instance, if we take post-Brexit, post-Trump reality, although I wish we didn't have to, but if we take that and we think about not so much in the post-Brexit, let me just focus actually on the post-Trump, the inability to develop a different point of inception with which to think about where journalism needs to go right now in view of what's gone on with its reporting of the presidential race and administration. It baffles me. It shows what I am seeing right now is not only excessive theorizing about what needs to change, that takes very small incremental steps and doesn't go far enough, and at the same time a kind of inability to recognize that the failure is fundamental. So it's almost like people are suggesting Band-Aids for a gaping wound that is going to kill the patient if you don't massively rearrange things. And so, you know, I mean, my favorite relay that came out this year was, I think it was in March. It was when Reuters sent out, my own alma mater, sent out a relay to all of its reporters, all of its correspondents, saying something along the lines of, we know how to cover the Trump administration because we cover it every place else in the world, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America. We just have to figure out that we need to be rethinking what it is we think we're covering. And I think they use the word banana republic. I wouldn't go that far, but the point is that that's how massive we have to be rethinking what journalism does. So if it's things like relying less on official sourcing, I mean, that's a given, right? No, not enough people have been doing that. And so the whine, the continual lament continues to be, they're not telling us the truth. Of course they're not telling you the truth. Go find the truth from other sources. So I think that the ability for journalism to kind of rethink itself right now, of course, you know, it's easy to sit on the outside and say this is what we need to be doing, but there needs to be far more daringness, far more bold action, far more imagination in figuring out alternative ways to get journalism done. Because journalism is too important. It's too important to assume that, you know, we'll move toward, you know, the environments like Vice or BuzzFeed, or all of which are extremely important. They're extremely productive factors in the news environment, but they can't do it on their own. And so we need legacy, conventional, mainstream journalism at the same time as we need all of the alternative views at the side.
I mean, you know, raising Trump and in a way, and your thing, I mean, it strikes me that with the 24-hour news environment, it's almost like there's a kind of lack of space. Everything's compressed, and in a way, what Trump has done has shifted the ground. No one quite knows how to respond. There's a kind of sense of we re-entrench back into our values, and in a sense that kind of rather than necessarily reflecting out and opening on, almost the default response is, well, you know, as you say, they've got to find out he's not telling us the truth, and you say, well, you've got to move on and think of, you know, and it's that lack of space to strategize. I just wondered whether you...
Well, look, journalism has always been tasked with responsiveness. I mean, that's what journalism is. Journalism is a response to events and issues that take place outside the purview of the news. And that responsiveness always needs to be crafted under rapidly evolving circumstances, usually, you know, scant resources, high decision making in circumstances that don't foment easy, rational kind of changes or responsive mechanisms. And I think that the important thing to recognize here is that if journalists don't step out a little bit, this is just going to continue. It's just, you know, and I'm a little befuddled by the fact that there hasn't been more change than there should have been. I mean, yes, we do see some news outlets, you know, saying that they're going to, you know, create new news beats that are more attuned to you know, the people on the right that it's pretty clear were kind of shafted out of the news. And that's a good step. It's a step in the right direction. So there are some steps, but the steps should be far more manifold than they've been.
Yeah, because I mean, I think the point for me would be, you know, in a way with the US politics and particularly the polarization that's going on, that the reimagination isn't just something for maybe for what you would call progressive news outlets. It's, you know, what's happening is kind of in the sense of the fragmentation of the journalistic field, and that's kind of worrying from the outside looking in.
Yeah, and I would say that the problem isn't just with journalism. The problem is with institutional culture writ large. The question, of course, you know, and this is why I feel that, you know, normativity really has not delivered what it needed to, because normativity is about pristine conditions. Well, how the heck do you figure out how a journalist should be ethical when you've got a rogue president, right? Like, you know, all of these institutions are working in tandem with each other. You cannot enforce any kind of normative behavior that doesn't take into account these rapidly unfolding and often rapidly deteriorating conditions on the ground. So, you know, I think we don't give journalism enough due for what it does do, but certainly right now we're not giving it enough credit for what it might do, not what it should do.
What it might do. Thank you. Okay, can I move on to really your kind of seminal book, About to Die, which kind of, at least for me, and I'm sure for many readers, made a kind of really drew attention to something which was, I suppose, just a taken for granted part of the news, that actually really kind of challenging issues around death and dying and the representation of that. And can I maybe start perhaps what got you thinking about the ideas behind that book, and
well,
because of your own journalistic experience in the Middle East?
No, it wasn't my journalistic experience. I mean, actually, I would argue that all of my books are about death. My children laugh at me because my study is the guest room, and now that they're older and they come back, they say that they hate going into it because once they look at all the books on the shelves, it's a little gruesome. You know, death is one of the most fundamental drivers of the news. The news deals in death all the time. And so I think that a lot of what constitutes good news is often about the transformations that come with death and dying. And so, you know, my book on the Kennedy assassination, there you've got death. My book on the Holocaust, there you've got death. So About to Die, I think, really does draw from issues that I've been looking at for years and years and years. The difference with About to Die is that I made the decision that rather than looking at the tensions between the verbal and visual record in one particular event, which is something that I've done multiple times, because I think it is a very useful way to highlight what the visual does differently than the word. I decided here to really look at the ways in which journalism portrays death across different kinds of events. So assassinations, terrorism, war, natural disaster, accidents, they're all in there. And what I found is that regardless of the actual situation, the depictions of death were often the same. And by that I mean that journalism regularly gravitates away from its most explicit depiction, which is that of a dying body, that of a dead body, to that of a person about to die. And that's why the book is called About to Die. My argument is that the reason journalism will tend to substitute pictures of the already dead with pictures of the about to die is that it engages the public in a more subjective, more enchanted, if I can use that word in a kind of off way, certainly more engrossed fashion than does the picture of somebody already dead, because somebody already dead objectifies it. It creates distance. There's not much you can do. So this is a persuasive tool of the first order. It is also a tool that, let's face it, news executives and publishers appreciate. They don't want pictures of the dead strewn across the front pages or the web pages, the first web pages online. The issue with this, of course, is that it raises a very fundamental question as to what images are actually doing in the news. Because if we were to have the same kind of gravitation backward in our words, i.e., that we hear a news report that tells us of somebody about to die, but doesn't actually document that he or she is already dead, we would be aghast. We would say that's not telling the story. So my question is really, it has two subsidiary questions, which is, A, either images are not as important as words, which I would vehemently contest, because of course images are all over the place. They're every place but the news. And if we look at movies and television, comic books, you name it, we have the graphic pictures of death that we don't get in the news. So we're getting the pictures, we're just not getting them in the news. So either images are not as important as words, or images need to be given an equivalent treatment as words are. And I think that that's really the question as to why that isn't something that bothers people. Just this morning, North Korea released, or just yesterday, North Korea released a 20-year-old University of Virginia student who it had held captive for over a year. And this boy had gone into a coma. He had massive brain damage already a year ago. What do you think the picture was that was across all media, all over the world? It was the picture of him being shown completely awake, completely alert, speaking, right, in a hearing in North Korea a year ago. So that's the kind of, and one has to say, the reason this news story exists is because the boy was released comatose, right? But that piece of information is nowhere in the visuals that accompanied the story. So I think we either have to say words are not as important, which I contest, or if words are as important, we have to create the kinds of treatment that allow them to function as they do. And I think that the about to die picture is a response to the fundamental skepticism that we have about visuals in the news, despite the fact that we are a more visual-centric, image-centric culture today than we've ever been.
Now, saying you're just kind of takes me to what's been happening in London with the tower block fire, and in a way that the visual image of the not a moving image, but an image of the face, and then it's the mobile phone messages of the people who presumably...
And the picture of the building on fire. The picture of the building on fire is a classic example of an about to die image, because you know cognitively that there are people in that building. You don't see them. You don't see the human impact of that fire. All you see is a building that stands in for death. And that, I think that we can do better for our public. I think that we can do better as a society to use images in ways that inform. I mean, that is what the news is supposed to do. And the idea that in situations of great crisis, of great conflict, whether it's terror or it's war or it's natural disaster, we turn to images. We have a turn to the visual where we see more images than at any other time in our media spaces. And yet those images show us less than they have ever before in history. If we look back, we know that the one time, the most recent time, that we saw extensive documentation of human death was after World War II. It was in the Holocaust. And that was because the US Signal Corps and the British, in part, agreed that these pictures needed to be shown. So this was a propagandistic decision. It was a decision to go to the camps. All of the army photographers were sent, they were rerouted across Europe. They were sent to the concentration camps, told to take pictures, and then those pictures were mounted everywhere. Every newspaper, journal, magazine carried not just one, but 15, 20 pictures of stacks of bodies. There were sidewalk exhibits of blown up pictures from the concentration camps they were in London, they were in New York, they were all over the place. They're certainly in Germany. The point is that was the kind of mandate that was needed to be able to create the kind of responsive environment for journalistic images that is needed. It's a kind of combination of technology and politics and morality. We don't have that anymore. And so today we are constantly left to imagine, to fill in the images that we are not seeing, and I don't think that that's a very useful thing for a public to be doing in conjunction with its public events.
Okay. Thank you very much, Barbie. Thank you.